The smell I remember most is Tim Hortons' coffee going cold in the cup holder. My aunt had picked one up at the drive-thru before we left, and by the time we pulled onto the highway, she hadn't touched it once. That's how I knew something was wrong. My aunt always drinks her coffee before it gets cold. Always. My name is Lena Calloway. I'm 34 now. And this is Second Seat Stories. The story of how I found out, at 31, that my entire life had been built around a choice someone else made for me. To understand what happened that March, I need to take you back to the morning it started. My mother called me into the kitchen and told me to sit down. She'd sounded strange on the phone the week before. Clipped, careful, like she was measuring every word before she let it out. She'd made tea, which she only does when she's nervous. She didn't hug me at the door the way she usually does. She just said, "Come sit down, Lena," and walked back to the kitchen ahead of me. I sat at that table, the same one I'd eaten 10,000 bowls of cereal at as a kid, the same one where I'd cried after my first heartbreak, and my mother told me that the man I'd believed to be my father since birth was not my father. She said it plainly, not cruelly. The way you say something you've rehearsed so long the emotions worn smooth. My biological father was a man named Arthur Brennan. They'd been together when she was 22. She'd loved him. She'd found out she was pregnant, told him, and he'd said he wanted to be part of our lives. Then she met someone else. A man with a good job, a house in the suburbs, a future that looked stable from the outside. And she chose that instead. She never told Arthur. She stopped answering his calls, moved cities, changed her number, let him believe, through a mutual friend's mistake, that she'd miscarried. She never told me. Not in 31 years. I sat there and listened to all of it and didn't say a word. I couldn't. When she finished, she slid a piece of paper across the table. A name and a phone number, handwritten. Arthur had hired a lawyer 6 months earlier. He'd never fully let go of looking. She said she'd gone back and forth for months about telling me, but in the end, decided I deserved the choice. I asked her one thing. Does he know about me? He's known for about 8 months. I left without finishing my tea. I sat in a parking garage back in Hamilton for 45 minutes, not crying, not really thinking, just sitting with the specific heaviness of learning. The story you've been living inside isn't the one that actually happened. The man I'd grown up calling my father, my mother's second husband, the one with the stable job in the house, had left when I was 9. Moved out west, sent birthday cards until I was about 12, then stopped. I'd made my peace with that, or something that looked like peace. But this was different. This was learning there'd been someone else, someone who hadn't known I existed, someone who'd been looking. I didn't call the number that week, or the next. I put the paper in a drawer and tried to feel normal. It was my aunt who finally sat me down, 3 weeks later, at a Tim Hortons off the highway. She told me she'd known, not everything but enough, that she'd pushed my mother for years to say something. Then she looked at me and said, "He lives in Nova Scotia now. Lena, I think you should go. I think you'll regret it if you don't." That night, I opened the drawer and unfolded the paper for the first time since my mother handed it to me. I didn't sleep. At 6 the next morning, I booked a flight to Halifax. I texted Arthur before I got on the plane. One line, my name, that I believed we might be related, that I'd be in Halifax the next morning if he was willing to meet. He replied within 40 minutes. "I know who you are. I've been hoping you'd reach out. I'll be wherever you want me to be. You set the terms." 4 words that told me more about a person than a lot of people managed to say in years. He walked into the coffee shop at noon exactly, taller than I expected, weathered in a capable way. He stopped in the doorway, found my eyes, went very still for a second, then walked over. He didn't hug me. He sat down, put his hands on the table, and looked at me steadily. "Thank you for coming. I know this couldn't have been easy. I don't really know why I'm here. That's okay. You don't have to know yet. We talked for 3 hours. He told me about the years after my mother disappeared. The confusion, the grief, the mutual friend who delivered the false news. How he'd eventually had to accept it and keep moving. He'd met his wife Rosemary in his early 30s. They'd had a daughter, Claire. He'd built a good life, but there'd always been something that wouldn't close. About 4 years ago, a feeling he couldn't explain led him to hire a private investigator. What came back took another year to understand, and another to figure out what to do with. He'd approached my mother's lawyer carefully. He hadn't wanted to blow anything up, just wanted her to know he knew, and that he thought I deserved the right to choose. "Why didn't you just find my contact information and reach out directly?" I asked. "You had it by then." He was quiet a moment. "Because I didn't want to be the person who walked into your life without warning and turned it upside down. I thought that should be your mother's choice to make, even if I didn't trust her to make it." I flew back to Hamilton 2 days later. I'd gone for coffee and stayed for 2 days, meeting Rosemary over fish chowder in their kitchen, sitting across from Claire, my half-sister, on their back deck wrapped in blankets against the March cold. She was 22, studying environmental science, with a sense of humor that caught me off guard. At one point she said, without looking at me, "I always wanted a big sister," then looked mortified she'd said it out loud. I told her not to apologize. On my last morning, Arthur made breakfast. Nothing elaborate, just eggs and toast and the ordinary machinery of a household morning. Before I left, I asked him the question I'd been building up to. Why hadn't he walked away, once the investigator confirmed everything? He had a full life. No one would have blamed him for closing the file. He thought about it honestly. I grew up outside Antigonish. My dad left when I was 7. My mother worked nights and we didn't have much, but she was always there. Somewhere in me, I decided if I ever had a kid, I'd be the kind of father who shows up. When I found out I hadn't lost the chance, that somewhere out there, you were real and grown, and you'd gotten this far without any of this, I couldn't just leave it alone. It would have meant something about the kind of person I was that I didn't want to be true. I've thought about that answer almost every day since. Now, here's the part of this story I didn't expect to be telling. About 6 weeks after that trip, once word had quietly moved through the family, as these things do, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in over a decade. My mother's second husband. The man who raised me until I was 9, and then stopped sending birthday cards at 12. The man I'd learned, a long time ago, not to expect anything from. "Lena," he said, like no time had passed at all. "I heard about your father." "Arthur, is it? Runs a business out east?" I didn't answer right away. "I just think, given everything," he went on, "it might be good for us to reconnect. You're my daughter too, in a lot of ways. I raised you for 9 years, and there it was. Not an apology for the birthday cards that stopped. Not a question about how I was doing, or what the last 25 years had actually been like for me. Just a casual mention of Arthur's business, followed immediately by, 'You're my daughter too.' I understood in that moment exactly what this call was. He hadn't heard I'd found my father. He'd heard my father ran a marine equipment business that had been going for over 2 decades and was doing well. He wasn't calling to reconnect with a daughter. He was calling to reconnect with an opportunity. I let the silence sit for a second before I answered. "You stopped sending cards when I was 12, I said. "You didn't call for my high school graduation. You didn't call when I got my first job, or when I moved to Hamilton, or on a single birthday for the last 22 years. And now you're calling because a man you've never met is successful. That's not fair." "Lena, I'm not finished," I said. And something in my voice must have surprised him, because he actually stopped. Arthur Brennan didn't know I existed for 31 years, and the second he found out, he hired an investigator and spent years quietly making sure I was safe and real before he ever let himself reach out, because he didn't want to disrupt my life without my permission. "You knew exactly where I was my entire childhood. You had my address. You had my number. You chose to stop showing up. There's a difference between not knowing someone exists and knowing exactly where they are and deciding they're not worth the stamp." He didn't have much to say after that. "I wish you well," I told him, and I meant it, in the distant way you can mean something like that. "But I already have a father. I found him, and I'm not interested in filling a second seat at his table for someone who only wants a view of it now that it looks like it's worth sitting at." I hung up before he could answer, and unlike the silence in my mother's kitchen months earlier, this one didn't sit heavy in my chest at all. It felt like setting something down I'd been carrying without realizing how much it weighed. I am 34 years old now. I have a good job in marketing in Hamilton, an apartment that finally feels like mine. a best friend who's seen me through more than I can count, and a cat named Biscuit who destroys my houseplants without remorse. And I have a father. Not the man who left for BC when I was 9 and stopped sending cards at 12. Not the absence I learned to fold into myself and carry. I have Arthur Brennan, who runs a marine equipment business in Dartmouth, makes good coffee, and once drove 4 hours through a snowstorm to watch Claire compete in a regional debate tournament. I have Claire, who sends me voice memos because typing takes too long, who flew to Hamilton in September and left 3 hair ties on my bathroom counter and a half-eaten bag of ketchup chips in my pantry, who FaceTimes me more than friends I've known for 15 years. I have Rosemary, who texted me a fish chowder recipe 2 weeks after I left because I mentioned it was the best thing I'd eaten in years. And I have my mother. That relationship is the complicated part, and I won't pretend it isn't. There are things I haven't fully forgiven yet. She made a choice at 22 that she carried alone for 3 decades, and whatever I think about that choice, carrying it cost her something too. I see that now. I'm working on the rest. What I know is this. I grew up believing that people who mattered to you left eventually, that love had a shelf life, and if you were unlucky, you were what people moved on from. I built a whole quiet architecture of defenses around that belief. And then I unfolded a piece of paper in a drawer at 6 a.m. and flew to Halifax in the rain, and sat down across from a man who'd been looking for me since before I even knew he existed. I don't think my mother and the man who raised me meant to give me anything. I think they meant to close a chapter. What they actually did was leave a door slightly open. Arthur was on the other side of it, and I was just stubborn enough or curious enough to walk through. As for the man who called me 6 weeks later, I learned something from that too. That real love shows up before it's convenient, not after. And that some people don't deserve a second chance at a seat they walked away from the first time. If this story moved something in you, hit subscribe. This is Second Seat Stories, and there's a new one every day.